Here, exactly. It's good and a pleasure to see you here in person. And on that note, also to welcome everyone who's on Zoom. But I must say that there's something very special about the live interaction, and especially as we're going to relate to that a little today, as we continue with the source sheets from last week. So those who have them from last week, please take a look. And you're going to see that we're now on page 2. We're continuing within this very tense chapter. So just to remind everyone, last week we reviewed the transition of authors, basically from Shmuel Hanavi, whom, as we said, puts his quill down in chapter 16, with not only a focus still on Shaul HaMelech, but even telling us that while Vayasar Hashem, even when Hashem literally leaves Shaul and leaves, as we already know from Perek Tekva, from chapter 15, leaves the selection of Shaul, which has now been replaced through the divine selection of David. Nonetheless, as we mentioned numerous times, there are two components to Malchut, and that is divine selection, but there's also the popular vote. There's also the people selection. So even though not only was Shaul coronated separately by the Navi and therefore had a separate public coronation, so too he has a private, one can even say, divestment of his Malchut through the Navi in chapter 15, but he cannot be divested of the Malchut from the perception of the people until the people decide that they no longer want him as king. And that's what's going to create the tension, as we'll see in the ensuing chapters. But as we already saw last week from the transition from Shmuel's writing, which portrayed David being invited by Shaul to his home, being requested that he come primarily as a musician, and then the word, the very strong word that Shmuel Hanavi employs of Vayahavehu, and he loves him. Shmuel loves David and begins to train him even as his noseh kelav, even as his military attendant. And then Shaul, thank you, trains David even as his military attendant. And then at the very end of chapter 16, telling us that he then will start to send David upon various military expeditions. That perhaps is one of the many proofs that we began to discuss last year of teaching us that the end of chapter 16 really comes only after the events of chapter 17, after David has already proven himself as a valiant warrior, after one of the Abadim in chapter 16 can actually say that David is a Gibor Chayil and that Hashem is with him. Only then can we see why Shaul would invite David to his home. But then we continued with chapter 18. And in chapter 18, we have very different accounts of the same events. And there are different ways exegetically to understand this, either as a complement to what we saw in chapter 16, as Rashi says, various stages of David becoming not only the attendant, but a ben bayit, literally a fixture of the home of Shaul. But the other method is really not only shtei bechinot, seeing two different perspectives, but actually two different works of two different prophets. Shmuel Hanavi, who till his dying day and even posthumously is going to see himself as the core prophet and literally a father figure for Shaul. It is going to now be David's personal prophets, primarily Gad and Natan, Gad being more the personal prophet whom we're going to see accompanies David upon the various journeys in Midbar Yehudah, escaping from Shaul. So this makes sense that chapter 18 is going to revisit the same events that we've already heard about that take place after the war of David and Goliath, but from a very different perspective. So much so that it seems as the prophets of David already author chapter 17, with David in the spotlight, really almost to a certain degree, not just highlighting the cowardice of Shaul, but Shaul seems more of a secondary character in chapter 17. So let's quickly revisit the beginning of chapter 18, where we are right now, and Jen is reminding me.
Yes, that it's interesting that music comes up in both.
Excellent, in a very different way. So Jen, I'm so happy you said this. And which chapter is it much more pronounced?
Well, in one, he's playing privately, and that's
beautiful.
But in the other one, the other people are making music, and that's irritating Shaul.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to see even chapter 16, if you revisit very quickly, and the advice even for one of his attendees to have someone come and play musical instruments is to alleviate him of the ruach ra'ah that we discussed is either a vacuum of the presence of God that is no longer with him, or an additional, again, bitter spirit, a paranoia that seems to overtake him. And no matter how one wants to look at it, it's alleviated through music, because music, as we know, enables one to reach a state of Ruach Hashem. I feel this is very significant as I'm looking at the Kranzler family over here. Again, Mamasha Chazanot. Isn't it true, though, that music literally again brings one to a greater spiritual state where one feels this closeness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the reason why this is so significant is because, as Jen mentioned, in chapter 16, the primary reason to invite David to Shaul's home is to play music. Is he thinking initially, even though this seems to really come after chapter 17, after David has valiantly fought against this giant, against Goliath, and yet that's not what's encouraging Shaul to invite him in. The pretense is, let him be a musician. It just so happens, though, that this musician is also a phenomenal warrior whom Shaul is then going to train to go out to war, which we've already seen is something that he's doing less and less by virtue of the fact that he no longer has Ruach Hashem, which manifests itself predominantly in success in war. So now, just as Jen said, let's look again at the beginning of chapter 18. And not only are we going to see how this chapter is definitely written by the Navi of David with the focus on David, it is also going to tell us about the various relationships. As you quickly again peruse the first page of Mareh Mekomot, we hear about the relationship between Yonatan and David. But we're also, just for a moment, what we're going to attempt to do, as we noted in all our shiurim, is we're going to attempt to ignore chapter divisions, because here's a very good example of how the 13th century Vulgata or Vulgate does not really align with what we call the Masoretic Parsha divisions. And therefore, let's go back even one pasuk earlier, right? Or even two, if that's okay. We're going to go back just for a moment, as you see, to Pasuk Nun Hey. Uchirot Shaul et David yotzei lekrat haplishti. It's almost as if this pasuk underscores that Shaul really, until this moment, had no prior and relationship with David, underscoring that chapter 16 really came after. So much so that he turns to Avner Sar HaTzava ben Miza Hana'ar. He figures the general must know who he is, because here's this young boy fighting against the giants. Vayomer Avner chi nafshecha hamelech in yadati. So clearly he couldn't have already been attending Shaul in wars, because even the Sar Tzava doesn't know who he is. Shaul doesn't know who he is. Vayomer hamelech she'al atad ben mizeh ha'elim. So you find out who he is. Already the Navi is placing all the relationships here, not in the context of music, but rather in the context of David's military might. And this is very significant. The Navi doesn't want to say that David made it into the king's palace because of his musical talent. Rather, he made it into the king's palace because he actually is going to be more skilled than Shaul is, because he's going to be the greater warrior to fight against the Plishtim, which is the pretense, if you recall, for why the people initially even requested a king. And therefore, he really is the more worthy king. Everyone notes that. Shaul does, Avner does. So much so that Ukeshuv David mehakotet haplishti vayikachoto Avner veyeviyehu lefnei Shaul. Notice that this time also we have very strong terminology, more of the verb form of PL, vayiviyehu. He brings him almost by force before Shaul. And notice this ironic situation. Verosh haplishti biado. David still has the decapitated head of Goliath in his hand. Can you imagine? This valiant young boy stands before the king, who should have been the one to fight and face off against this Plishti giant. And here he is in front of the king with a decapitated head, again, as if this doesn't bother anyone. And the The king then asks of him, again, he says, "Vayikach oto Avner, vayomer elav Shaul ben mi ata hana'ar." Even asking someone that, right? He doesn't say, "Ma shemcha," but rather, "Ben mi ata." What is he already doing? Also downplaying his independence, right? Whose son are you, right? He doesn't know him, doesn't even ask his name. And how does David answer? Vayomer, David ben Avdacha Yishai beit halachmi, right? It's not just Vayomer David. Vayomer, David ben Avdacha. David basically asserts himself. I am David, the son of your servant, who really supports you in all your military expeditions, the son of Yishai from Beit Lechem. Right? And this, as we discussed last week, perhaps is even what attracts Yonatan, to see his foil, right? Another guerrilla warrior who is able, though, to stand up to the father that Yonatan can stand up to. And we're going to continue to discuss the dynamics and really the tension of the Yonatan-Shaul relationship. But we already explored that a little last week. If you remember, now, Paragin Pasuk Aleph, Vayikach alato ledaber Shaul, v'nefesh Yonatan nikshara v'nefesh David, vayaohavehu. That was the exact same term that Shmuel HaNavi employed back in chapter 16 with regard to Shaul loving David. This Navi is telling you, wait till you hear, Shaul doesn't love David. Who really loves David? Yonatan loves David. Vayikachehu Shaul bayom hahu v'lo netano. How does this Navi depict how David entered the king's palace? Vayikachehu. He didn't invite him. He wasn't nominated to come. He was taken by force, almost dragged. That's the sense that we have. And that's exactly how this Navi is writing the story. That as opposed to, as we discussed, Shmuel wants to explain to Shaul, look how HaKadosh Baruch Hu coordinated all of these events. Look how you have an option of bringing David in. It's almost as if Shmuel ends by telling us that Shaul was still working with this divine plan. And he recognizes that he has an option of bringing someone who will ameliorate his terrible, fraught feelings of ruach ra'ah. And he could have had, as we discussed numerous times, again, choose your own adventure. He could have had David not only relieve him of his terrible ruach ra'ah, but also lead to war. And we also discussed that in chapter 17, we see that Shaul had already offered his daughter to whoever would valiantly fight. So what a perfect transition for David, the divinely appointed king, to now make his way into the house of Shaul. There could have been a unified kingdom very early on, and yet Shaul is going to choose differently. This Navi, again, Gad HaNavi, writing in chapter 18, is basically telling us the story post facto. Post facto, he says, don't think that David willingly went, and don't think that this was really, again, about his musical talents, and that, again, just Hashem had set it up. It could have worked out that way. But in the end, Shaul takes him by force, vayikachehu. And not only that, but the term vayikachehu Shaul bayom hahu v'lo nitano lashuv beit aviv. And he doesn't let him go back to his father's home. Much more forceful than what we saw in the previous chapters. Vayichrot Yonatan v'David brit b'avoto oto kenafsho. And I don't want to revisit everything from last week, but for those who weren't here, we already see a brit. A brit in the context of Yonatan and David means some type of political military alliance of which we don't necessarily hear all the details now, but they will come within 2 chapters.
Who loves you?
Who loves who? In the
Brit.
Brit Vavato. So you already know who's the subject and who is the object. Back to Psukim. Excellent, but it's Vayichrot Yonatan. Yonatan is B'lashon Yachid. It doesn't say Vayichrotu. So just Vayichrot. Now you're right that a Brit is, so it seems to be right now a one-way love. Just as we had in chapter 16, with Shaul, it seems to be a one-way love. That's an excellent question. And yet we'll see by Shmuel Bet, by Kinat David, that David will actually say that he loved him too. But here it's Yonatan. And the reason why that's significant and why I can say this with full conviction is that by the end of the Perek, who else is going to love him in a one-sided way? Michal. So here the Navi frames the chapter with a one-sided love of both the son of Shaul and the daughter of Shaul, both love David, and we don't hear that he loves them back. That will definitely create tension on many levels. But what is blatantly missing? The son loves David, the daughter loves David, and yet Shaul does not love David. And this is underscored all the more so when we hear that Yonatan revisits, as we said, divesting of his vestments to David, and David literally can wear them as opposed to Shaul's that we saw in the previous chapter, and he trains him again with his cherev and with his keshet. He trains him in all different forms of warfare, again, both in sword and even with the archery of Sheva Binyamin, Va'ad Chagoro, Vayitzi David B'chol asher yishlachenu Shaul yaskil, and everything that Shaul sends him out to do, giving us now the impression that even though, as Shen mentioned, we are going to hear about the musical theme, but it seems based on, again, glorifying David, that really what was the primary reason why Shaul had, can't even say invited him anymore, had taken him into his household to serve as a military sergeant. Excellent, you did a great job in the war against the Plishtim. Now I want you to go and go off and fight other expeditions, and each time he does, again, yaskil. So much so that Vayisimehu Shaul al Anshe HaMilchama. And now you can't help but promote him, giving us the impression that, again, even this way explains the Navi, this could have been perfect. So much so that I'm sure, what is David thinking right now? David is thinking, I'm fighting these wars. That's what the king is supposed to do. Eventually, the king is going to give me his daughter in marriage. Eventually, I'll become king. We'll see that that's exactly what the Brit with Yonatan was about. And this makes so much sense. That Hashem is making sure that in a natural way, again, without too much friction, without too much tension, without a coup d'etat, again, this way, I will transition into kingship. Makes a lot of sense. Shaul then also doesn't yet, as we'll see, doesn't see David as a threat. He sees him as a wonderful way of compensating for his shortcomings. He feels vulnerable. He is terrified about going out to war. David is fighting these wars. Excellent. And sure enough, Vayitav be'enei kol ha'am v'gam be'enei avdei Shaul. And what is blatantly missing over here? Vayitav be'enei Shaul. And that's why the Navi continued. And now the Navi is either telling us in chronological order or revisiting something that had already happened. When the girls came dancing, as we said last week, and they said, possibly not meaning anything, but rather that's the rhyme and meter, a biblical song. How did Shaul understand that? Maybe even post facto. They're giving David the tens of thousands and me only the thousands. So I'm just skipping what we had learned last week. We're now in Pasuk Chet. Vayichar l'Shaul ma'od. And it's not clear exactly and when this anger set in. It could be that as David, after verse 5, after David is already successful, then Shaul looks back and he realizes, wait a second, the people preferred David to me. They like him more than I do. I'll prove it. When we came back for more, the women even sang, David, David beruvotav. Or we can say that the Navi is sharing with us step by step, just as we find in the story of the animosity of Yosef Achav, that it's important for us to recognize that these aren't sentiments that developed overnight, but rather over time. Which, note then, why is that important? Again, back to the story of Yosef Achav. Why is it important that we hear every single step along the way? Yosef divatam hara'a el avihem. That we then hear Vayichalom Yosef Chalom. That we hear Vayitena Aviv Ketonet Pasim. That we hear again Vayisnu Oto. That we hear about a second dream Vayasifu Otno Oto. That we hear that he tells his father the dream V'Yaakov Shamar et Hadavar. And then Vayikanu. Why do we have to hear step by step? Why can't we just fast forward and hear that the brothers are jealous, they want to kill Yosef? For the same reason here, to teach us that it's a process psychologically, that these sentiments do not aggregate overnight, but it's also teaching us that at any stage, we could have stopped it. And therefore, for example, in the Yosef story, who's to blame? Yosef, ve'achad, ve'aviv, and his father Yaakov. Yaakov, instead of shamar et hadavar, what could you have done? Give him a little tochacha. That's exactly it. Yosef, as soon as you see that the brothers v'lo yachlu ledabro l'shalom, what should you have done? Maybe not tell them another dream about your anticipated malchut, but rather sit down and have, a group session with them. Then maybe go for family therapy. And I don't mean this just in the contemporary sense, but again, don't further aggravate their sentiments. And the brothers, if you already know that you hate him, the next time he comes to tell you a dream, what should you have done? Say, Yosef, please. Again, we don't want to hear the dream. Instead of being, as we know, that they couldn't speak to him, but they acted as if everything was fine, then just be a little more truthful. Be people of integrity. That could have stopped. And literally this downhill decline towards, as we know, Galut Mitzrayim. So too here. The Navi tells you, and we'll see how significant this is, really is a prelude for what I mentioned last week. It's one of my favorite shiurim on Sifrei Shmuel. I know I say that too often, but then basically, the Navi is teaching you at any moment, could Shaul have stopped? Could he have, again, reflected upon this and said, maybe this is what Hashem wants? And that's exactly how the Navi, as we're going to see, puts these into the words of Pasuk Chet. Sorry? Why couldn't Shmuel have seen it? I think Shmuel could have seen it, and yet either chooses not to or hopes that Shaul will overcome on his own. That's why he wrote chapter 16, to tell him it's true, the Malchut is being taken away from you, but Hashem is still affording you an opportunity of salvation. You can actually have a continued line through David, through literally unifying with David. You could stop here and instead say, if I can't beat him, then join him. But he doesn't. And that's exactly Pasuk Chet. Vayichar l'Shaul ma'od.
I want to say that the dominant emotion here is Kim'ah, both by Yosef and Achav and by Shaul. And Kim'ah is something that people hide so well.
Sounds
You know what I'm
something
saying?
terrible. Because
So
Kin'ah always leads to
Sinah.
Sin'ah, which leads to violence. That's exactly it. We're all too familiar with
But
this.
I'm saying the reason why it wasn't recognized not by Shaul himself, and maybe not even by David, is because Kim'ah is an emotion that is very commonly hidden very well.
Yes, but who knows it? Who knows if they feel Kin'ah? The person does. The person. Now it's interesting that here we don't actually find the term Kin'ah,
Right.
which is interesting. First it starts as Vayichar. That's okay. I think, people get angry every once in a while. Vayichar l'Shaul ma'od, step number 2 now. Well, it's really, again, we saw the absence of love, the absence of tov. So one is, okay, he doesn't have to love him anymore. I understand. No love. But everyone else thinks David is doing a great job. Not Shaul, no tov. Next stage, Vayichar. Now you know. This is very difficult. Once one is angry, it's difficult to stop the emotions, but is it still possible?
Yes.
Yes. Vayichar l'Shaul ma'od, vayira be'inav hadavar hazeh. What davar hazeh? Natnu leDavid rabavot, v'li natnu halachim. And how do you know that there is kin'ah without it saying kin'ah? Because it says it. Va'od lo ach hamlucha. What's he already thinking? Now he's going to take the melucha. Now, why say it that way? Why not just say Vayikanei Shaul v'David? Because Shaul still has something that David doesn't, which is the melucha. However, what does he know from Perek Tetvav? Shmuel told him that the malchut is going to be given l'reacha hatova mimaka, and that's why we said here's Snow White right away. Again, the evil stepmother, knowing that there is someone fairer than them all, and waiting to see who could it be, who could it be. Again, that's exactly it. Shaul the whole time says, okay, there's going to be someone. I don't know who it is. He's not a threat to me now. I'm still the melech. But now he sees someone who literally is not just replacing him, but fighting the wars that he should be fighting. He is now, this person is really garnering the people's success. All that's keeping Shaul in a position of malchut right now is the people's approval. If he loses the people's approval, then what does he lose? He loses the melucha. So what is Shaul going to try to do? Really prevent him and the people from, and really preventing the people from admiring David even more. That's one way, but that's very difficult because that means that you have to control an entire nation. What's much easier? Instead of controlling the people, I'll just sabotage David. So that's the next stage. Va'od lo achamlucha. Vayhi Shaul oyein et David. Oh wow, that's much harsher than vayichar. Vayichar is one is angry. The oyein is someone
Husband.
is hostile. He is now going to be hostile mahayom hahu vahala. Now, the question that we obviously have is, doesn't David know this? Doesn't he see the change? But we already know that where is David by now most of the time? Most of the time he is out of the house. Most of the time he's fighting the wars. The only time he would know this would be when he's in front of Shaul. And that's why we have the next story. So we're going to learn the next story in the most conventional manner. And then we're going to learn it in the most unconventional manner. So I hope you're excited for this. Pasuk Yud. Vayhi mimacharat. Now, obviously, what does that mean? The day after what? The day after the parade? The day after means that macharat is, and the ensuing events, like Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, Vatitzlach ruach Elokim ra'a el Shaul. As we discussed, every time we find the word Vatitzlach in the stories of Shaul, beforehand it meant literally nivu'ah, in Seltzach, Vatitzlach, and that seems to connote that, again, as opposed to nivu'ah, he now has the absence of nivu'ah, or one can argue that this is a very active form, that God is actually implanting in him a ruach ra'ah, the opinion that, I'll be honest, that I less like by virtue of the fact that then it seems that Hashem, exactly, that Hashem is almost and harnessing his bechira choshit. And therefore, the first opinion about Tzlach tells us instead of having nevuah, what's he feeling right now? The absence of nevuah. And why is that? Why should he be feeling nevuah now? Because we're going to see the continuation of the pasuk. Vayitnabei betoch habayit, v'David menagen biyado, kiyom biyom, v'hachanit biyad Shaul. Every clause here needs elaboration. Firstly, as we said, the ruach ra'ah, Elokim ra'ah el Shaul seems to, in fact, be the absence of the ruach tovah, because where is Shaul now? With David, b'toch habayit, v'David menagen biyado. Not only that, what word definitely stands out is mentioned, vatitzlach goes together with vayitnabei. What does vayitnabei always mean? So we're going to see this inside, and we're going to see that it doesn't necessarily mean that he's actually receiving nivuah. Vayitnabei can also mean he's trying to receive nivuah. He's in the process of trying to achieve nivuah, so he feels this metamorphosis, he feels this spiritual sensitivity, and then instead of again really feeling nevuah, he has this ruach elokim ra'ah. But in the context of nevuah, it seems that this perhaps is part of the nevuah, giving us the impression that somehow the ruach ra'ah has what to do with this vayitnabei. And that's why, beautiful, that's why most of the Parshanim, the conventional explanation, as we're going to see in just a moment, most of the Parshanim explain that this is really a terrible feeling that he has that's coming from Hashem. It's not nivuah, rather, he's possessed by this ruach ra'ah, even though, and how does he even get to this state? How does he even get to any state of even pseudo-nivuah? V'David menagen biyado kiyom biyom. Generally, when David plays in front of him, as every day, what generally happens? His ruach ra'ah goes away because now he feels lefachot a ruach tovah, maybe sometimes even a ruach Hashem, but this time it's a ruach elokim ra'ah. David menagen biyado kiyom biyom. David has, notice also, as I mentioned, why every clause is so important. And as such, David has an instrument, a musical instrument in his hands. V'hachanit biyad Shaul, and Shaul has a spear. Why is that significant? Who was the last character that we saw that had a chanit? Goliath. Again, we haven't seen this chanit by Shaul until now. Again, but now we heard 3 times over. Do you remember in chapter 17? Goliath has a kidon and a chanit, a kidon and a chanit. And the next time we hear chanit, it's in the hands not of Goliath, but of Shaul. This clearly tells us that the Navi is projecting Shaul as an enemy to David, no question. Vayatel Shaul et hachanit, and Shaul lifts up the chanit, and he says, Vayomer ake b'David ubekir. Perfect. David is playing right here. Imagine, or many of you, I'm sure, have been to concerts here in Matan at the Kidvuni convention. Rachel Goldberg was playing right over here. Imagine someone playing here, and you're all sitting, and again, you all have darts in your hands. Imagine a chanito. He says, perfect. David is right in front of the wall. I will literally pierce him to the wall. Perfect, right? And this way, get him out of the picture. Again, hachanit biyado, vayatel shol et hachanit vayomar ake b'David ubakir, and again, vayosab David mipanav, vayisov David mipanav ha'amayim. What happens? David turns twice, giving us the impression that how many times did he try to kill him? Twice. Anything bother you about this?
Yeah.
What bothers you? Thank you. What happened to the chanit after the first time? Meaning he tried once and David moved. So excellent. So one could argue that, okay, David saw what he was, and he moved before he threw the chanit, or that. No, he has one chanit. Excellent. Maybe the same time even. Excellent. Again, he moved here and there, which is hard because Shaul is also, remember, we discussed, he's also an archer. That means he's an excellent sharpsman, right? He knows exactly, right? He has excellent aim. And yet David is very quick on his feet. But this is strange because I would think that if he really did try it once, then if you were David, why would you stay? Thank you. Get out of there. Toda Tamar. Nachon, why pa'amayim? This is very misleading. I don't understand. Again, so he said, maybe in one sense, we'll see in just a moment, some Parshanim say that actually David he's a very skilled musician. What is he doing? He maybe has his eyes closed, maybe is so focused on his playing that he didn't notice, and he didn't move to avoid the chanit. He just happened to move. And it didn't just happen once, it happened twice. And that's why Vayirash Shaul milifnei David. That's why Shaul now is going to be scared of David. Beforehand, he felt that he could be the one to kill him. He could sabotage David. Why? Ki haya Hashem imo. He says, that's a little too circumstantial.
It says mipanav.
Thank you. Thank you. All the more confusing. Kol hakavod. The mipanav doesn't help us because it seems that he really did move mipanav, knowing that Shaul is trying to kill him. I agree. This is very difficult. So, or, okay, once and then
it happened
2 hours later. It's hard to say a different setting entirely because the Navi goes out of his way to portray a setting. And he doesn't say, but maybe a few hours later. Maybe.
I just want to say, I mean, I can't accept that it's not from Hashem,
Which part?
like David.
Thank you. I also have a hard time with that. But it's nabe, meaning if you want to say that he's possessed by this evil spirit, but it's coming from Hashem. So it's coming from Hashem that he wants to kill David. Doesn't that bother you?
It bothers me, but.
What's David
You
thinking?
can't say it's not Nevuah.
Nachon. I also, why use the term nivuah? So we're going to see how the Parshanim are going to be very troubled by this, which is why I love this section so much. We're going to have such a great time. Everything in Tana was just the prelude. Mitnabim, that's exactly it. It was a real nivuah. I'm very confused.
This whole thing.
Okay, fine, could this whole thing really be a nevuah? Kol hakavod. So hold that unconventional thought, which I really think is pshat, mamash, and I'm still looking to find someone who says it, even though I think that I have significant source for this. And that's what happens when you learn mamash. I love this. This is called nachat. When mamash, everyone offers mitzvahs. Thank you. So then how do you understand? Just wound him. Excellent. It doesn't say kol hakavod that he wants to kill him. He says to himself, akeh b'David. Now, very often, akeh actually means to kill, like makat mavet. But even if it was to wound him, let's say, so he can no longer go out to fight anymore, so that the people won't, be satisfied, he'll be a patsua, that's right. And if that's the case, then I'll just wound him. Still, we have all these other questions, right? Of why would David stay then? And by Yisov David, so much so that this is what gives Shaul the impression, oh my, Hashem imo. Hashem is really with him. Umeim Shaul sar. And he's no longer with Shaul. But didn't Shaul know that? The answer is yes. But until now, we discussed that every time David, back to chapter 16, every time David played before Shaul, what would happen? Shaul would feel this Ruach Hashem. And what did he think? Through the music, I'm now uplifted. Now Shaul realizes that when David plays, what happens? Until now, he was enjoying the Ruach Hashem. He never had the Ruach Hashem. It was all because David was in his presence. And now he knows that because he tried something, Hashem isn't with him. He feels the Ruach Hashem. And therefore, he tries to kill or to strike David. And a feeling, okay, now I have that military prowess that comes with Ruach Hashem. But in the end, no, I don't have it. And now we find a beautiful literary technique known as anadiplosis, when a Navi takes a word and in order to show you how one idea directly leads to the other, he'll employ one aspect of that word in one pasuk and then another in a different. He takes the word diplosis, literally chops it up. Everyone see this? Umeim Shaul sar. What was sar, meim Shaul? The Ruach Hashem has left Shaul. Vayisirehu Shaul meimo. And therefore Shaul removes him. Who is the him? David, who has the Ruach Hashem, which you're supposed to say, that doesn't make any sense. If David has the Ruach Hashem, and you no longer have the Ruach Hashem, Omeim Shaul Sar, what should you do, Shaul? Omeim Shaul Sar, so keep David close to you. And if you keep David close to you, what will you have? As much Ruach Hashem as you could possibly have. But instead, again, the Nabi wants to say, choose your own adventure. Shaul could have realized, Umeim Shaul Sar, and what could the next pasuk have been? Vayashlema Shaul im David, he makes shalom with us, he keeps David there, he says, David, again, I'm going to be selfish, you stay here instead of going out to war, but instead, Vayisirehu Shaul mi'imo. By removing David from his presence, Shaul is making a very stark comment, which is, I'm removing God from my presence. I am distancing myself from Ruach Hashem. And this isn't just, again, a bad decision. This is, one could argue, one of Shaul HaMelech's greatest shortcomings, and that is a theme that we've seen from the very beginning of the Shaul stories, where he's always trying to rationalize and almost outsmart Hashem. Okay, I'm still going to do this. And how do we know he's trying to outsmart him? Take a look at what the Navi tells us. Vayisimehu lo sar elef. He now promotes David. Vayitze vayavo lifnei ha'am. So that what is he doing? He is going out to war, and we think, wait a second, that's not a very good decision. Again, that's going to make him even more popular. But we'll see, 2 psukim later, Vayhi David l'chod rachad maskil v'Hashem imo. Again, every time Shaul thinks that he's going to try to sabotage Hashem's plan, no, it doesn't work. What we see is that he's going to send David out onto very difficult military missions, but each one is going to, if anything, train David to be more of an Isechel. He's going to be able to advance through this. Vayar Shaul asher hu maskil ma'od vayagar mipanav. And then comes the paranoia, then comes the fear. B'chol Yisrael v'Yehuda ohevet David ki hu yotzei bava lefneihen. And then Shaul is going to use this again as a ploy to try to have David killed. But the strongest pasuk perhaps is, in fact, v'yisirehu Shaul mi'imo. If David, you now know, David has the Ruach Hashem by literally distancing him, v'yisirehu. The Navi is saying he's also distancing God. That this could have been the turning point in the story where, and we would think, why do this? And shouldn't you keep David closer? So now we're going to explore this passage from all different perspectives, as we saw the scene at the bottom of page 2 by Yitznavei b'toch habayit.
The first pasuk says, "Vayisomem Shaul al anshe milchama."
Yes,
Is it low or is it higher than Sarah?
it seems
higher.
it seems higher.
No?
Nachon. So we're going to say there are parshanim.
Evokes him to Sarah.
Beautiful,
Just a group of small group.
excellent.
But
Beautiful.
still, David is still becoming more and more popular.
Kol hakavod, kol hakavod. So that's exactly what we're going to see. Mitsuyan, mitsuyan. Let's start though with this terminology of vayitznavei b'toch habayit. So as we said, at first glance, the story seems somewhat simple, right? Shaul is possessed. This is, I think, how most students learn this the first time they come across the story. And Shaul is possessed by Ruach Ra. He attempts to strike David, who narrowly escapes. But we're very bothered by certain terminology that we've already seen in the Shaul story, such as vayitznavei b'toch habayit, and he prophesied within the house. Again, so he's prophesying, but he has a ruach elokim ra'ah. He's prophesying, and then while he's prophesying, he's trying to kill David. And what does the term pamayim denote? Did Shaul actually attempt to strike David twice? That's difficult to imagine, as you all said. What, he went in, he took the chanid out of the wall and said, okay, David, let me try again, right? And why is David still in the room as this vulnerable target? So, and perhaps also, why then, as a result of this story in particular, v'yisirehu Shaul. Shouldn't Shaul keep David closer to him? Shouldn't he not have him go out and gain greater popularity? Why now remove him from his presence? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvaro. So here's where the adventure begins. We're going to begin with the classic parshanut. Then after we also see other questions, the top of page 3. Why does Shaul conclude that Hashem has departed from him, specifically because of the story? Why would Shaul appoint David as military commander if he truly seeks his death? Would not he have preferred to keep him close under his watch? And even more is, now we're going to see something very striking. Generally, we don't do this in learning Nevuah, but in order to appreciate the story, or basically to even aggravate some of the questions, if we just fast forward one chapter to chapter 19, verses Tet and Yud, there we find, and everything is on your sheets, Vatihi Ruach Hashem Ra'a El Shaul V'hu Bebeito Yoshev V'chanito Biado. You can imagine biblical critics love this. They say, oh, wait a second, the same scene in chapter 18 seems to reappear in chapter 19. That Shaul has another Ruach Hashem, and David is there also, but David menaged bayad, v'yivakesh Shaul lahakot b'chanit b'David ubakir, exactly the same terminology. And he's going to strike David ubakir, v'yitar mipnei Shaul, and this time David didn't just move. What did he do? He literally ran out. He slipped away. Again, vayachet hachanit bakir. And this time we hear, where is the chanit? It's actually in the wall. The David nas v'yimalei balaylahu. David ran away. Right? So maybe that's what Hannah was referring to, that this is the Navi wrote in the previous chapter that stay tuned because it's going to happen twice. So, but that's strange to tell us the first time that it happened twice. And even with that, even if it was only once the first time, if David knew this, and why not just run away the first time? Why does he only run away the second time? So obviously we can only understand this if we go back to the beginning of the narrative, which is Vayitznavei. Shani.
It's possible that David is in disbelief. I mean, David doesn't know what's going on in Shaul's head.
Excellent.
And so the first time he tries, David is not quite sure, did he really deliberately do that or not? Okay?
Beautiful.
But the second time he understands that it's deliberate.
Excellent. Excellent. So now if the second time is really part of the first episode, then
It don't make sense.
Exactly, if the second time is the first episode, then it makes sense, but if it happened twice in the first episode, then you should have already run away the second time. So maybe he didn't notice, or maybe, just as Shani said, even after 2 times, he knows that Shaul has moods, right? And he's like, okay, right, I got away. Maybe it didn't even go into the kier. Again, perhaps. So in fact, Rashi says, Vayitnabe, we see that what happens, that he understands it as nishtate, that there are different types of nevuah, that really mitnabe can also mean trying to receive nevuah. And we're going to see from numerous stories, even when Shaul sends troops to find David, who has escaped, ultimately he will escape to Shmuel in Ayot, to Shmuel's Navi training school. What do Nevi'im do? What are some of the classes that they take in Navi training school? They take speech 101, they have plenty of Chumash classes. Again, they also have yoga classes, right? They have musicology, right? Why do they need these classes? To reach a certain state. And as the Rambam tells us, based on Yirmiyahu, who explains, Ke'esh bo'er batzmotai. He really doesn't want to deliver his harsh nevuah, but he has to, because he says the nevuah feels like fire burning in my bones. Based on that, the Rambam qualifies nevuah almost when a Navi receives these messages of God, either in a preliminary state or actually while he's receiving the nevuah, it's more like an epileptic seizure. According to the Rambam, so much so, that can you actually tell if someone's in a nevuah trance, if they're in a state of nevuah? Yes. Do you remember we saw by Shaul that when he was with the Nevi'im, people around said, Hagam Shaul, but Nevi'im, how did they know? Not just because he was in the company of Nevi'im, but because it seems that he was in this epileptic state. So, explains Rashi, he's not actually receiving nevuah, but God is coming to him, and that's why it's Yitznabe. He's in that epileptic state without the content. He's not receiving nevuah. Again, basically, he says he became deranged. Again, he was in a state of madness, not prophecy, and this underscores what Shani said. Again, then we understand that what happened, Rashi basically is explaining that yes, the same preliminary stages of prophetic ecstasy that ultimately lead to nevuah, in this case, it didn't lead to nevuah, but rather it was really just a manifestation of madness. Who saw that? Who can tell then? David saw that, and therefore he already knew, be on guard. Okay, the Targum Yonatan interestingly says, again, Rashi bases it, V'ishtate, V'go Beta, he literally became deranged within the house, he was acting in a strange way. The Radak says he actually spoke words of madness. In other words, David hears him saying, when it says, Vayomar Shaul, Akeh b'David ubakir, he didn't say that to himself, he said it out loud. And what does David know? Someone who says that out loud, it's like someone saying, I am going to kill you now, right? And okay, David recognized that as well. He spoke words of madness, like a man who prophesied from his own imagination. And so according to the Radak, it's not that he was actually in an epileptic seizure state. It's not that he was entirely insane. Rather, he had this uncontrolled frenzy that David saw, right? It was very difficult for him to control. According to the Ralbag, he was speaking aloud his inner feelings, as we just said. Generally, you don't say these things out loud, almost as if he was in a prophetic trance, right? You know, someone who's hypnotized. I need chocolate cake. I need chocolate cake. I need to kill David, right? So what? That was basically, again, the term, that's how the Ralbag understands it. And basically he revealed what generally is not revealed, as was said, his kin'ah, his jealousy of David. So that's why the term nevuah is used, because nevuah is a window into the inner self, and not always a revelation from above. And so the Ralbag is closest to what we're going to see by calling this actually, again, the unconventional manner, calling it hirhurei nevuah, that really Shaul was experiencing some level of nevuah, the Abarbanel, and understands mitznabe actually as like a nevuah, meaning he was in a state not of a trance, but a visionary rumination that shows thoughts of David. He was already perceiving, he was in a trance, he could see David becoming king and his own downfall. Again, take on the character of his self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're going to see this as well. In other words, he was overcome with a psychological drive. Please keep that in mind. And the Malbim, who says, Lo nishtate, ela היה מתנבא כדרך הנביאים כשחל עליהם הרוח, אלא שהיה רוח רעה מאת השם. And please remember this as well. This is, again, the closest that we're going to see to the support that I'm looking for. The Malbim says it was a nevuah, just a really harsh nevuah.
רוח רע means that he had a נבואה רעה for himself.
It was a genuine nevuah. But if you turn to page 4, you'll see the Mitzudot says he was just speaking words of madness. Dat Mikra says he was behaving like prophets. He was trembling and agitated. As we said, he was in this epileptic state. And Rabbi Yoel ben Nuana, who explains as well, again, that this is really a corruption of Shaul's former prophetic gifts to show us the spiritual unraveling of Shaul, that he was almost there at Nevuah, but in the end, it completely turned around. Rav Samid, who explains that the Ruach Ra'ah represents that inner jealousy and the loss of purpose, the distortion of spiritual sensitivity into paranoia. But Yitznabe means that Shaul is spiritually sensitive, but his perception is darkened, prophecy twisted into pathology. Now notice that the common denominator of almost all of these parshanim is that Shaul's behavior is really a symptom of his madness, of being in a state of of delirium. In that moment of frenzy, he heard the spear at David, an act of uncontrolled impulse rather than deliberate attempt. And this then is the difference between chapter 18 and chapter 19. Why didn't David run away the first time, or even the first 2 times? Because what did he know? Shaul was in a delirious state. And only in chapter 19, then again, David says, wow, now I'm genuinely threatened. He didn't really feel threatened the first time. It was just, Shaul is having one of his epileptic fits again. So I just have to be on high alert. But realizing, though, the second time, he's not in a state of delirious intent. It didn't say Vayitznabe there. And that's when David flees. Hannah.
The term that like the afraid, like word Navi, I know we learn it in like Shmuel, but it actually comes from the fact that it means to be like a spokesman, like, right? Like
It means that ultimately, milashon niv. Exactly. Exactly.
Right? So, but it, like we always assume that it's prophecy, but actually it's rooted in something else. There was something that he was like, he was in the middle of speaking, like he was in the middle of running like Knesset or something, like he was giving.
Mitsuyan. It seems that there was some speech, right? Aked David Bakir. The question is whether the action was in real life or in his nevuah. Yafema'od. So still Vayitznabe, and he said something, but maybe even just said it to himself. Or Vayitznabe, he's in the stages that ultimately are supposed to leave. First, you need the nevuah, and then you say it. For example, we didn't hear exactly what his nevuah back in Perek Yud Gimel was either. So it doesn't have to come immediately with speech, albeit you're right that the goal of nevuah is ultimately to have the Navi express it, even though, because Shaul is not a Navi, but a Melech, he has these episodes, but he doesn't necessarily have to address them in speech. And the reason this will be so significant is because even according to the Malbim, who explains by Yisod David that yes, David was engrossed in playing, he didn't even see what Shaul was doing, and Hashem orchestrated that he turned aside inadvertently, and that's how Shaul knew that Hashem was really with David. So Shaul therefore removes David from his personal retinue, assigns him to the rank, and just as was said, basically as a Sar Elef, which the Malbim says explicitly, Kol HaKavod, the Sar Elef is a demotion, right? He's demoting him. He wants to distance David from royal proximity and basically show everyone that he's disappointed in David. Or Dat Mikra says that he no longer wants David in his presence because he sees that Hashem is with him, which we said that's ironic, or that he now feels, well, until this point, every time David is with me, I had a Ruach Hashem, a positive feeling. Now what do I have? A Ruach Ra'ah. I don't want David with me anymore. Or maybe, and this is what we're going to see, maybe why does he distance David from him? Maybe because he's afraid that next time he may really kill him. And that's why Vayagar, he's really afraid, but maybe he's afraid of himself. which brings us to what Jen alluded to, which I think is alluded to by the Malbim and the Rabbanit as well. And now we're going to see this even further, which is, as Hannah just said, Vayitnabe generally means that he was attempting to prophesy and he prophesied. How do we know that? Let's take a look. Again, we're going to use the pshat. Again, where do we see the term? Already in Perek Yud. Vayavo sham hagavata v'nei chevel neviim lekrato v'tzitzach alav ruach Elokim vayitnabe b'tocham. We said it could mean that he's trying to receive nevuah or that he actually receives nevuah. But here, the same word then. We haven't seen that word since Perek Yud. But everyone said Hagam Shaul b'neviim. It seems that Vayitnabe actually means that he prophesied. That's right. And the third source, take a look in Perek Yud Tet, Vayelach haloch Vayitnabe. Sure enough, when he'll go to pursue David by Shmuel in his Nabi training school, Vayitnabe ad bo'o berama. That's exactly it. He's also in a state of prophecy. And therefore, again, people say Hagam Shaul b'neviim. And the fourth source, Vayishot Gamhu, Vayitnabe Gamhu Lefnei Shmuel. Yes, he's in an epileptic seizure type of state. And again, Nevi'im in the state remove their clothing. So now we understand why some Parshanim understand based on the fourth source in Perek Yutet that Shaul was in a state of madness, but this was also the state of Nevuah. And we also have it in Sifrei Hayamim, Vayitnabe Eliezer ben Dodahu Mimaresha. So this is interesting because he's a Navi Sheker, but it could be that he had a real Nevuah that was then distorted. He decided to distort his Nevuah. So we have sources that seem to say maybe it's not a real Nevuah, but plenty of sources that imply that it is. In which case, how do we understand this Nevuah? Vayitnabe. God came to him, and already the Nabi is telling you this is a Ruach Ra'ah. Don't think that every Nevuah is a positive Nevuah. That's exactly it. In a state of Nevuah that he reaches because David is playing. Shaul has a Nevuah. In his Nevuah, what does he see himself saying? I'm going to kill David. In his Nevuah, what does he see himself doing? Not just once, but twice. In his Nevuah, what does he see happens twice? That he fails. And why now is he Vayura? Now he knows Hashem is with David. How does he know Hashem is with David? Because in his Nevuah, what does he see? It's a message from Hashem basically telling Shaul, no matter how many times you're going to try to kill David, what's going to happen? It's going to fail. So whether this is an allusion to all of his future attempts by Midbar Zif and En Gedi, Hashem is saying, you're going to try, Shaul, you're going to try, but you're going to fail. Now Shaul knows, oh my, I'm going to fail. Hashem is with David. So why remove David?
Yet he goes and he does it.
Yeah.
Excellent. So why remove David? Now this makes so much sense. Why remove David? Because he's scared of himself, which means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu affords him what we call a premonition of Nevuah. Hashem says, please remember, Nevuah is not what will be. When a Navi speaks to us on a national level, he doesn't say, okay, I can see exactly what is going to happen. He doesn't tell us what is going to be. He tells us what could be. This is what could be. When Amos stands by, I always picture, by Tekoa, and he sees destruction, but then after 9 chapters of destruction, he says, but I can see that one day you're going to come back here and you're going to build and you're going to have this land blossom. V'lo yinatshu od mi'alat matam. He basically says, I don't know when this is going to be, but at some point you're going to fill up this whole area. I picture him from Tekoa. For those from Gush Etzion, you look out on the 7 hills of Efrat, and I picture that Amos saw that. Did he know when it was going to be? He didn't know that it was going to take literally 2,800 years. It could have taken maybe 100 years. There were many opportunities for us to come back before. And Amos says, but I'm telling you, I see that this is what could be. And one day you're going to come back here and you're never going to leave ever again. So too, Hashem says to Shaul, this is his nevuah. This is what could be. This is what could be, Shaul. It could be that you may be so overtaken with this paranoia and this jealousy. It could be that you're so fearful of losing the people's opinion. It could be that instead then, knowing that Hashem no longer sees you as the future of kingship, that you have an opportunity also to have an alliance with David. But it could be that instead you're just going to try to kill him. So I'm sharing this with you, Shaul, because it really could be. And what would have been a wonderful response for Shaul to overcome? And it seems that initially Shaul does. Shaul says, I don't want this to happen. I don't want it to happen. So what does he do? I see Hashem is with him. I see that I don't want to be the vehicle of his death. I don't want to be the one. If he is going to die, he'll say, okay, let other people kill him. I don't want to be the one. And he at first casts him out. But then comes chapter 19, and what happens? He's overtaken by these terrible feelings again. And can he overcome them? We're told technically he could, but he chooses not to, which now helps us understand why didn't David run away the first time? Because nothing happens. It's all in Shaul's head. Let's prove it for a moment. Because in his nevuah, Shaul saw himself doing it twice. That's why we said it's strange. Why, if it's pamayim, that meant that what happens? He tried, he missed. What should he have done? Take the chanit again. Why doesn't it say it? Because it's all in his mind. It's not really in the wall. It's all in his mind. Wow. These are exactly, Chazal say dreams are a 60th of nevuah. These are called hirurei nevuah, literally premonitions of nevuah. Maybe some of you have ever had this. You ever have a very, very powerful dream, and then you wake up and you heard on the news, but that's scary. Now, what if the nevuah, though, or the dream, isn't about something that could happen? It's about something that you could do. What does that tell you? Oh my gosh, I'm thinking about a dream that I had last night. And I don't want that. I don't want to, again, I don't want that to be the state. So you become, ideally, the goal of Hirurei Nevuah we're going to see is that Chazal will tell us that Hashem shows Hirurei Nevuah for the sake of us to improve, to change, to be better. That's exactly it. And we'll see some other cases right now, but I saw that there were a few questions, comments. Tamar?
Just gonna say, I think that Rav Samet really is awesome words for vision.
Thank you.
But also accepting that the second situation says it's prophecy twisted into pathology. So you can say that the second you heard, when it happens in reality, when it turns into a pathology, then it's no longer, it's a mental illness, it's not within his control. And that's how I remember learning it actually as a child.
Exactly. Which I think is so difficult because
There's still something about that stays with me, that
it's not something.
there's some mental illness happening here.
So there could be, but
Whether it's
what is the,
bipolar disorder.
yes, yes,
Or schizophrenia.
the Seder Gamor.
That's how it speaks to me.
Excellent. And you know what? And Tamar, that's okay. That really is. But what is the Navi telling us? Even that can be controlled, right? If you know that someone has
It can be dealt with.
it can be dealt with. Exactly. And again, people who have, again, it's like someone, you know what, and it's funny what goes on in courts, right? Now I have a mental illness and that's what led me to kill this person, right? So he's not responsible. No, if you know you have this mental illness, if you know that you have anger management issues, right? Then what does one have to do? You still have choice. You have a choice.
Definitely not excusing behavior.
Exactly. Meaning that's why I wanted to make sure,
Yeah.
meaning the Navi wants to make sure that it's not excused. And you could say he's in a very difficult situation. He has a terrible handicap. Again, what else can he do at this point? The answer is not kill David. And we've already noted that there are various options where he actually could have helped form a unity government, right? That would have been phenomenal. That's Yonatan's dream. So kol hakavod, because it could be, especially the second time, that yes, he still has this ruach ra'ah, but knowing Perek Yudchet, knowing our chapter, what does that tell us? He really had an opportunity to control himself. And let's even take a look at some of the Rishonim, where we see this idea of premonitions of nevuah.
And I was thinking that if he sent him out to war, it's like what David did with Hashem's husband.
Wow, I was waiting for someone to say this. Wow, and I was hoping no one would say this so that when we get to it, kol hakavod. That Shaul is going to send David out to war to have him killed so that he won't be the one to kill him. And we're going to see that's also terrible. In the end, David himself is going to revisit that. But pretend you didn't know that. Because I don't even know if we're going to get to that this year. But remember this year, remember that brilliant comment. Kol hakavod, kol hakavod.
But you
Mitzuyan.
don't see in all his directions of thought that he had an intention of David being killed.
Exactly, meaning
Not
based
like-
on the
not like
way.
we are was very specific, I wanted to get killed.
Right, so in this scene, it could be that he really doesn't want David to be killed. He sees a vision of himself trying to kill David, or even saying that I want to kill David. By chapter 19, he definitely is trying to kill him actively. Excellent, that's going to come up. Nachon, meaning when he sends him out to war, he doesn't want to kill him because of that premonition, but of course he wants him to be killed by others. So take a look at Ibn Kasbi. Ibn Kasbi, who, as we know, is the Rav and inspiration also of Ibn Ezra. He says, Da'od, he savur b'kol hasipur. He says by Yonah. Says that Yonah also is an interesting story, right? Did the story of Yonah actually happen? And I can't believe I'm saying this in the last no minutes remaining. But we have dealt with this in the past. I remember a few years ago, and addressing Yonah really from a prophetic perspective. There's a machloket amongst the Rishonim. Did the story of Yonah, definitely the first part of Yonah, when he's swallowed by a big fish, did that really happen? So how were we all brought up? Of course it happened. That's why it was a maze. That's why we say, Mishana Leona b'mei hadaga hu ya'anenu. However, that seems to be who would not like these supernatural, exactly, miracles, the Rambam. Beautiful. So sure enough, Ibn Kasbi as well, he says, and you don't have to say that the first part actually happened. Ki yesh omrim shaya kulo beheketz. Some say that it actually happened, that the narrative happened while Yonah was in an alert state. V'yesh omrim shaya kulo bechalom uvimare hanivuah. That he saw himself and getting on a ship. He saw himself being thrown off the ship. He saw himself, again, refusing to deliver the nevuah. He saw himself going 20,000 leagues under the sea and then being swallowed by a fish. And only in his nevuah does he see himself offering a tzbilah and then being spewed out in his nevuah, and then he actually wakes up and either really gives the nevuah or maybe even in his nevuah gives a nevuah, right? But it seems that the first part is what Ibn Kasbi is referring to, which means that, wow, a nevuah can mean not that these events actually happen, but that they happen in your mind. The Rambam says this as well. Mitzuyan, if you, that means that which opinions does he like? He likes the Yesh Omrim, right? And in light of this, Ubi oracles it, but same thing, Otzar Hashem Yavo. If you explain it this way, then Otzar Hashem Yavo. Right? What does that mean? He's saying that's the better way to understand it. Then you'll really understand Yonah. So we'll have to wait again to revisit that shiur, but Moreh Nevuchim as well. The Rambam tells us that again, with regard to Nevuah, most Nevuah is given b'mishalim. It's not always given, and it's always in an amorphous form, and certainly then not all the events. He certainly believes that more often than not, the Nevuah happens in the person's mind than it is actually in real life. So let's conclude together at the top of page 6, the two similar stories that are not repetitions, but first a prophecy and then its fulfillments. David does not flee after the first episode because he's unaware of Shaul's vision. Only when the prophecy is realized does he take flight. Similarly, the word Ha'amayim now makes sense, and a literal account of its failure to react after 2 spear throws seems implausible. But as a vision, the 2 times may symbolize 2 stages of the prophetic experience, or 2 dimensions of its message. Shaul's subsequent reaction likewise becomes much more intelligible. Having seen in his vision that Hashem delivers David from his hand, Shaul realizes the implication. He fears David because Hashem is with him and has departed from him. In other words, this prophetic image reveals that David is not merely the people's hero, but Hashem's chosen protege, guarded by divine providence. Yet Shaul remains uncertain when you have such a state, he's wondering, was this really a divine revelation? Maybe it was a dream that was really born of his own anxious thoughts. But then again, in Marim Lo Ladan Ela Mehurei Libo, whether it was a nevuah or his own anxieties, they were definitely an expression of what he was feeling. So torn between these possibilities, Shaul is afraid of himself. He removes David from his presence, fearing that the vision might come to pass. He begins to seek indirect ways to harm him. And let it not be me. We'll continue Be'ezrat Hashem in 2 weeks, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But in Pasuk Yitzayin, let it be Biad Plishtim. When Yonatan later intercedes, Shaul seems to regain composure. You're right. Don't worry. He swears that he's not going to harm David for a brief time. We have to give Shaul credit. Someone here told me I'm having a very hard time with Shaul. And I understand, but give him some credit. Even now, what credit can we give him? He doesn't want to kill him. He wants to try to overcome. He suppresses the prophetic vision and the terror that it inspired. But it's David's continued success that we're going to see that rekindles his jealousy and rage. He once again seizes the spear and this time truly casts it at David. And in this, I can't even say vision, but in this reality, David escapes. At that moment, Shaul comprehends fully that what he had seen was indeed prophecy and not his imagination. Hashem's spirit had passed from him to David, as Shmuel Hanavi had already told him, and now it was confirmed. From this point onward, Shaul will pursue David with relentless fury. Instead of continuing to conquer these feelings, now, does it say, by the way, Vayachazek Hashem et libo? Is Hashem leading Shaul to do this? No, Shaul is going to pursue David. And that's why Shaul distances David from him. But again, David's appointment to an important military rule just exacerbates Shaul's fear of him, because even when he demotes him, what ends up happening? That ends up being to David's advantage, that he succeeds all the more and he gets more credit from the people, and therefore he dreads him. So notice again, Be'ezrat Hashem, and we're going to continue with this and then see the contrast from the beginning of the perek to the end of the perek, but we haven't finished the perek. But this week, Be'ezrat Hashem, tomorrow night, I'll be traveling on behalf of Matan to Chutz La'aretz. So we don't have live shir this week. However, Baruch Hashem, we have Melissa Raymond, who runs the Matan Beit Shemesh branch, and she has recorded a shiur and on the next part of Perek Yudchet. So she and Yardena will make sure that everyone in this class receives a recorded shiur of what we're up to. So please watch and rewatch or watch. And this way, Be'ezrat Hashem, in 2 weeks' time, then we'll be able to complete the Perek together and move on. Shavuot Tov. You have to sign up. In order to receive the Zoom, you have to be registered in the class. You have to be registered in the class. Oh, it actually is recorded. Oh, that's interesting. But let's send it out to everyone who's registered. But it is available on the Matan website. Give her a big hug.
And someone asked a question.
To repeat it. The Zoom and the Zoom. You're right. You're right.
Bob, anytime, Bob, because they've been and where are you? When you in Chicago, tonight or tomorrow? I told my niece to come here and to introduce yourself.
Wow, okay.
Your daughter's in, something with a name.